I was 27 years old when this happened. At the time, I worked the overnight shift at a small convenience store attached to a gas station on a state highway in Kansas. The place sat between two small towns, so traffic during the night was very unpredictable. Sometimes 30 minutes would pass without a single customer, and then 3 or 4 cars would pull in almost at the same time. I worked that shift alone from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. The station only had 4 pumps, a small snack area, a few aisles of basic products, and a storage room in the back where we kept inventory. Back then, I really needed the extra money from the night shift differential, so I accepted working alone without complaining. It was early autumn, and the nights were already getting cold. I remember that on that particular day, the wind made a constant whistling sound outside as it passed through the station signs. Shortly after midnight, business practically disappeared. I was behind the register organizing some invoices while the radio played quietly in the background. The air conditioner produced that continuous hum that eventually becomes part of the silence. Everything seemed completely normal until the automatic door opened and a man walked in alone. The first thing I noticed was that he did not look like someone who had just filled up his gas tank. Normally, customers who come inside during the night either leave their car at the pumps or park directly in front of the store. When I looked out the window, I did not see any vehicle that appeared to belong to him. The man looked to be around 50 years old, maybe a little older. He was wearing a simple dark jacket, blue jeans, and an unbranded baseball cap. Nothing about him seemed particularly strange. He entered without greeting me, grabbed a shopping basket, and started walking through the aisles. At first, I did not pay much attention. I was used to indecisive customers, but after about 15 minutes, I began noticing something odd. He would pick up a product, study the packaging for several seconds, turn it over to read the ingredients or nutrition information, and then place it back exactly where he found it. This was not occasional behavior. It was all he did. He picked up a granola bar and put it back, picked up a bag of chips and put it back, picked up a soda and put it back, and he did all of it very slowly. At times, I watched him through the security cameras above the register and got the impression that he was not actually interested in the products. He seemed more interested in staying inside the store. After nearly 40 minutes, I started feeling that difficult-to-explain discomfort. It was not exactly fear yet. It was more the feeling that something did not make sense. During that time, 2 customers came in for gas, paid quickly, and left. The man remained inside the entire time. At one point, he stood in front of the beverage cooler for several minutes without opening a single door. He just stared through the glass. I remember looking at the register clock and thinking that the situation was becoming ridiculous. I even considered that maybe he was waiting for someone or simply trying to warm up from the cold outside. But there was something strange about the way he moved. He never seemed surprised when changing aisles. He never appeared to be looking for anything specific. It was as if he already knew exactly where he was going next. When I watched him through the cameras, he would sometimes disappear from one frame for a few seconds and reappear in another aisle without any sense of urgency. The strangest part was that whenever I looked directly at him instead of watching him on the monitors, he avoided making eye contact with me. He did not seem nervous. He seemed deliberate, as if he did not want to start any interaction. When the store had been quiet for nearly an hour, I finally decided to ask if he needed help. I stepped out from behind the register and walked a few steps down the center aisle. The man was looking at a shelf of cleaning products at that moment. I said something simple, the way any employee would. "Sir, are you looking for anything specific?" He slowly turned his head toward me. It was the first time I had seen his face clearly. There was nothing frightening about his appearance, but I remember feeling an immediate chill. Maybe because he had been observing me for much longer than I realized. He answered in a calm, quiet voice. "No, I'm just checking a few things." I started walking back toward the register when he added another sentence. "Did you move the extra freezer in the back?" I stopped immediately. Behind the counter was a restricted area separated by a door marked "Employees Only." Inside was an upright freezer where we kept replacement frozen products. Customers could not see that area from any angle in the store. Not from the entrance, not from the aisles, and not from the windows. I turned around and asked how he knew there was a freezer back there. The man simply gave a small smile and replied, I thought it used to be closer to the cardboard shelf. Then he went right back to looking at the products as if he had never said anything. At that moment, I felt a cold sensation in my stomach that had nothing to do with the store's temperature. What he said was correct. A few days earlier, our manager had actually moved that freezer during a reorganization of the storage area. It was not information that customers could know. Even delivery drivers rarely entered that section. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was a former employee. Maybe he had worked there years ago and was simply making a random observation. I returned behind the register, trying to appear calm, but my attention became completely focused on him. I pulled out my phone and sent a message to the manager asking whether he recognized the description of any former employee. Since it was almost 1 a.m, I got no reply. Meanwhile, I continued watching the cameras. The man went back to walking through the aisles exactly as before, picking up products, examining them, and putting them back. But now I was paying attention to something else. Several times he discreetly looked up at the cameras mounted on the ceiling. Not the way someone casually notices a camera. He looked like someone checking where each one was pointed. The more I watched, the more uncomfortable I became. The entire store felt too quiet. I could hear nothing except the hum of the refrigerators and the wind hitting the outside walls of the building. A few minutes later, a truck pulled in for fuel. The driver came inside, paid for gas, and bought a coffee. I took advantage of his presence to feel a little more at ease. When the truck driver left, I immediately looked toward the aisle where the man had been standing. He was gone. I assumed he had moved to another aisle, so I checked the cameras. The soda section, nothing. The snack aisle, nothing. The back aisles, nothing. My first thought was that he had left while I was helping the customer. But when I reviewed the front entrance camera, I found no footage of him leaving the store. I rewound the video several minutes and watched again. I clearly saw the truck driver enter. I saw him pay. I saw him leave. At no point did the other man walk through the front door. My heart started racing for real. I stepped out from behind the register and searched the entire store, looking between the shelves. I called out to him twice. No response. The place was far too small for someone to simply disappear. When I reached the restricted area behind the counter, I noticed something that immediately made my skin crawl. The back door, which was normally locked from the inside, was slightly open. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at the door. I knew I had locked it at the beginning of my shift. It was part of my routine. When I arrived, I checked the back door, inspected the storage room, and only then took over the register. On top of that, the door had a strong spring that normally kept it shut. Even when unlocked, it rarely stayed cracked open like that. I approached slowly and felt the cold night air coming through the gap. The wind made the door vibrate lightly against the frame, producing a dry, repetitive tapping sound. I looked out toward the parking lot through the store windows. There were no customers, no cars arriving. No lights except the station lamps and the occasional headlights of vehicles passing on the highway. I pulled my phone from my pocket and gripped it tightly. My first instinct was to call the police immediately, but I still tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe he had accidentally exited through that door. Maybe he had seen an employee use it on another day. But that did not explain how he knew details about the storage area. It also did not explain why I had not seen anyone cross through that section. I knew I needed to find out what had happened. Behind that door was a narrow service area leading to the main storage room, and a small outdoor corridor used for unloading merchandise. I turned on every light I could find along the way. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel the pulse in my neck. The storage room smelled like cardboard, cleaning products, and gasoline, a smell I knew so well that I normally barely noticed it anymore. That night, however, every detail felt amplified. I checked between stacks of boxes, behind the freezers, and in the corners where we kept extra inventory. I found nobody. When I reached the outdoor corridor, I noticed that the metal door leading to the back of the property was also open. It normally stayed closed because the manager did not like animals wandering into the loading area. Outside, there was only darkness. The station lights did not reach that far. I used my phone's flashlight to illuminate the gravel ground. That was when I noticed recent tracks. They were not perfectly defined footprints, but there were clear signs that someone had passed through there not long before. The problem was that the tracks did not head toward the highway. They wrapped around the building. I quickly went back inside and locked every door I could find. Then I called the local police. I explained the situation and mentioned the strange man. The dispatcher asked whether he had threatened anyone or committed a crime. I said no, but I explained about the restricted area and the open back door. They said they would send a patrol car to check things out. The next 20 minutes were probably the longest of my life. I stayed behind the counter watching the security cameras nonstop. Every time a shadow appeared near the gas pumps, my entire body tensed up. At one point, I thought I saw movement near the side of the building on an exterior camera. I zoomed in, but the image quality was too poor to make out anything clearly. I kept watching. A few minutes later, I noticed something that made me even more nervous. One of the outside cameras captured a small section of the back corridor. While reviewing the footage from a few minutes earlier, I could see a figure standing for several seconds at the very edge of the frame. I could not see a face, only a dark silhouette watching the building. Then it disappeared back into the darkness. The police finally arrived shortly before 2 in the morning. 2 officers searched the entire building, the parking lot, and the area behind the convenience store. They found nobody. I showed them the footage and explained everything that had happened. One of the officers became particularly interested when I mentioned the man's comments about the freezer and the restricted area. They watched the footage several times. The strange thing was that there was no clear record of him entering the employee area. None at all. Throughout the entire time he was inside the store, the cameras only showed him walking through the aisles. Yet he somehow seemed to know specific details about the storage room. Before leaving, one of the officers asked whether anyone had recently worked there and been fired. I said I did not know. They wrote everything down and promised to look into it. When the patrol car left the parking lot, I felt completely alone again. The highway was empty once more. The wind continued blowing outside, and I still had almost 5 hours left in my shift. After the officers left, I tried to return to my normal routine, but honestly, I could not. I remained behind the register pretending to organize merchandise, but my attention stayed fixed on the camera monitors. The store felt different after that. The silence seemed heavier. I kept looking toward the front door every time I heard the wind or the distant sound of a truck passing on the highway. Around 3 in the morning, I finally received a reply from the manager. I sent him a description of the man and asked whether he recognized anyone. A few minutes later, he replied that he had no idea who it could be. He also confirmed that the freezer had indeed been moved only a few days earlier. That message made me even more uneasy, because it eliminated the explanation I had been trying to accept since the beginning. If he was not a known former employee and did not have permission to enter the back area, how did he know exactly where things were located that no customer could see? I kept replaying the conversation in my mind. The way he answered seemed far too natural, like someone commenting on something he had known for a long time. It did not sound like a guess. It did not sound like an attempt to scare me. It sounded like a casual observation, and that was what bothered me most. About half an hour later, something happened that completely destroyed whatever sense of safety I still had. I was watching one of the exterior cameras when I noticed a flash of light coming from behind the building. At first, I assumed it was a car passing on the highway, but the light appeared again a few seconds later, always from the same spot. I zoomed in and watched carefully. It looked as though someone was using a flashlight behind the building, briefly pointing it at the ground before switching it off. It was not a steady light, just short, spaced-out flashes. I immediately picked up the phone and called the police again. While waiting for someone to answer, I kept watching the camera. The light appeared 2 more times. Then it vanished completely. The dispatcher informed me that another patrol car would be sent when one became available, but explained that it might take some time because only one patrol unit was covering that area that night. I understood, but it did not make me feel any better. I continued watching the monitors for nearly 40 minutes. The light never appeared again. No person emerged. No vehicle entered the parking lot. Even so, I had the constant feeling that someone was still out there watching the building from somewhere beyond the reach of the cameras. When my shift finally started approaching its end around 6 in the morning, the sky began to brighten slowly. Normally, daylight made me feel calmer, But that morning was different. I was exhausted and full of questions. The manager arrived shortly after 6:30. Before he even took over the register, I asked him to watch everything that had happened. Together, we reviewed the footage from the moment the man entered until the moment he disappeared. That was when we found something I had not noticed during the night. On one of the interior cameras for only a few seconds, it was possible to see the man standing at the end of an aisle staring directly into the camera. By itself, that would not have been unusual. The problem was the timestamp. At that exact same minute, another camera showed the same aisle completely empty. We reviewed it several times to make sure we were not confusing the times. Eventually, we discovered that one of the cameras had frozen for a few seconds and replayed older footage without me realizing it during the night. In other words, part of what I had been watching while alone might not have been showing what was actually happening in real time. Once we understood that, an uncomfortable possibility immediately came to mind. Maybe I had missed something important while trusting the monitors. The following week, the manager told me that the police had conducted a few checks, but they never identified the man. Nobody in the area seemed to recognize him. No similar incidents had been reported recently. The case simply died there. They never discovered who he was, how he entered the back area, or why he had been moving around the building during the night. I continued working at that gas station for several more months afterward, but I never forgot that night. The detail that still bothers me the most is not the open door or the flashlight behind the building. It is the fact that the man seemed to know the place better than I did. Every time I remember how casually he mentioned the freezer and the storage room reorganization, I feel the same cold sensation in my stomach that I felt that night. I have heard many strange stories from people who work alone overnight, but that was the only time I ever truly felt that someone was studying every detail of the place without anyone noticing. And honestly, if he had some kind of plan that night, I do not think I will ever know what it was. Story 2. I was 21 years old when this happened. That summer, I was attending college in Oklahoma City, but I had returned to my hometown during break to save money. I got a temporary job at a 24-hour convenience store located on the edge of town near a state highway that was busy during the day and nearly deserted during the early morning hours. I worked the night shift, usually from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. The store was small but busy enough that truck drivers, travelers, and local residents stopped by throughout the night. Most of the time I worked alone. The manager only arrived in the morning to take over the register. After a few weeks, I had gotten used to the routine. I knew which customers came in regularly, which trucks stopped consistently, and even which hours were usually the quietest. On that particular night, I was nearing the end of my shift. There was a little over an hour left before the manager arrived. The sky was still completely dark, and the air had that heavy summer heat typical of Oklahoma. Even with the air conditioning running, I could feel my shirt sticking slightly to my back whenever I stepped outside to empty the trash or check the gas pumps. At around 4:40 in the morning, I noticed an old pickup truck slowly pulling into the parking lot. It was an older model, probably from the 1990s, with faded paint and patches of rust visible even from a distance. The vehicle did not pull up to the gas pumps. It also did not park in front of the store like most customers did. Instead, it stopped in a side parking space near the edge of the property. I watched without paying much attention at first. Some people stopped to check their phones or look at maps before continuing their trip, but the minutes began to pass and nobody got out of the truck. Under the parking lot lights, I could see that there were 3 men inside. The driver had his arms resting on the steering wheel. The other 2 remained motionless in their seats. Every now and then, I noticed reflections of their faces turned toward the store. After nearly 5 minutes, I began to realize that they were not talking, not using their phones, and did not seem to be looking for anything. They were simply sitting there watching the building. I tried to ignore it and continued organizing merchandise near the register, but every time I glanced through the windows, they were still in exactly the same place. After a few more minutes, I found myself paying more attention than I wanted to. Working alone overnight causes you to develop certain habits. When something feels out of place, even if there is no concrete reason to worry, you end up watching it. The pickup truck remained parked in the same spot. No doors opened, no gas pumps were being used. None of the men made any movement suggesting they intended to enter the store. I looked through the windows and sometimes got the impression that they were staring directly at me. not in an aggressive way, but in a steady manner that made me uncomfortable. That stretch of highway was very dark. Outside the circle of light cast by the parking lot lamps, everything became a wall of blackness. There were no other businesses open nearby. The closest gas station was almost 15 minutes away by car. I remember thinking that if something happened there, I would be alone for quite a while. I tried convincing myself that I was overreacting. After all, they were just customers sitting in a parking lot. Even so, I continued watching the cameras while pretending to organize cigarettes behind the counter. About 10 minutes after they arrived, the pickup truck door finally opened. Only one of the men got out. He was tall, wearing a loose gray t-shirt and a dark baseball cap. He walked toward the entrance without any sense of urgency. As he crossed the parking lot, I looked again at the other two occupants. They remained seated inside the vehicle. When the man entered, the electronic door chimes sounded normally. He did not appear drunk or agitated. In fact, he seemed extremely calm. He grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler near the entrance and walked up to the register. When he reached the counter, he placed the bottle down and stared at me for several seconds without saying anything. I found it strange, but I asked if that was all he needed. He said yes. I scanned the item and told him the total. While searching for money in his pocket, he asked a question that immediately caught my attention. He asked how many people worked there during the overnight shift. I answered that it depended on the day. It was a lie. At that hour, I was always alone, but I saw no reason to tell that to a stranger. He simply nodded and asked whether the manager usually stayed in the back office during the night. That question made me even more uncomfortable. I told him the manager was not there at that hour. I tried to keep my tone casual, as though it were a normal conversation, but internally I became alert. The man took his change but did not leave right away. He leaned against the counter and looked around the store. Then he asked what time the overnight hours were busiest. After that, he asked whether truck drivers usually stopped there after 5 in the morning. None of the questions were exactly threatening, but together they felt strange. They were not the kind of questions someone asks out of simple curiosity. While he spoke, I had the feeling that he was trying to understand the store's routine. I answered vaguely, avoiding details. The more evasive I became, the more he seemed to analyze my responses. At one point, he looked at one of the cameras mounted on the ceiling and asked whether they were all working. That was enough to make me genuinely uncomfortable. I gave a short answer and immediately changed the subject. The man simply smiled slightly, picked up his bottle of water, and turned toward the exit. As soon as he left, I automatically looked toward the pickup truck. That was when I felt an immediate knot form in my stomach. The other two men were no longer there. Both the front and rear seats appeared empty. At first, I thought maybe I was seeing things because of the reflections in the windows. I leaned over to get a better angle. Nothing. Nobody was inside the vehicle. I scanned the entire parking lot. Near the gas pumps, nothing. Near the air compressor area, nothing. In front of the store, nothing. The property was not large. Anyone walking around should have been clearly visible under the parking lot lights. The man who had just left the store was still slowly walking back toward the truck, but the other two had simply vanished. The problem was that I had not seen anyone leave the vehicle. During the entire conversation, I could see the pickup truck through the window behind the register. It was impossible that two people had crossed the parking lot without me noticing. For the first time that night, I felt real fear. Without taking my eyes off the windows, I began checking the security cameras. I quickly flipped through the exterior feeds looking for movement. That was when I found something that made me even more nervous. One of the side cameras briefly showed a silhouette walking alongside the building. A few seconds later, another camera showed someone moving through the area behind the convenience store. The footage was distant and low quality, but they appeared to be two different people. My heart immediately started racing. Behind the store, there was only a narrow corridor used for deliveries and access to the storage room. There was no reason for customers to be there. While I was reviewing the footage, I heard the door chime sound again. I looked up quickly. The man with the water bottle had returned. He looked directly at me and, in a completely calm tone, asked whether there was any exit other than the front door. At that moment, I became certain that something was very wrong. I immediately replied that I did not know what he was talking about, even though I knew perfectly well there was a service exit in the back. In fact, every employee knew about that door because it was used for deliveries during the day. The man continued staring at me for a few seconds. He did not seem annoyed that I had avoided giving a direct answer. He simply appeared to be filing away the information. Then he shrugged and slowly walked through the aisles near the register. I pretended to look at the computer screen, but in reality I was tracking his every movement. At the same time, I was trying to monitor the exterior cameras to locate the other two men. In one of the feeds, I managed to see someone standing near the side wall of the building. The person was in a poorly lit area and appeared only as a shadow. A few seconds later, they disappeared from view again. My mind started working quickly. I could not prove that those men were doing anything illegal, but the entire situation felt wrong. They had spent several minutes watching the store. One of them was asking questions about employees, traffic, and cameras, and now the other two were walking around areas where customers had no reason to be. I discreetly pulled out my phone and sent a text message to the manager. I explained that 3 men were acting strangely and asked how much longer it would be before he arrived. While typing, I heard footsteps approaching the register again. I looked up and saw the man standing at the counter once more. This time, he did not buy anything. He simply rested his hands on the counter and asked whether I had worked there for a long time. I said no. He then asked whether I usually worked alone during that shift. It was the second time he had essentially asked the same question. I tried to remain calm and answered that other people would be arriving soon. It was not exactly true, but the manager was expected to show up in about an hour. The man looked at the clock on the wall behind me. Then he looked toward the entrance. After that, he simply nodded. The entire conversation felt like an interrogation disguised as casual small talk. What bothered me most was how calm he was. There was no nervousness, no urgency, and no aggression. He seemed like someone verifying information he had wanted before even entering the store. Shortly afterward, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a reply from the manager. He said he was leaving home early because he needed to take care of a few things before the daytime shift started. Normally, that would not have meant anything, but at that moment, it was a huge relief. I immediately replied, asking him to come straight to the store. Meanwhile, the man finally walked toward the exit once again. As soon as the door closed behind him, I rushed to check the exterior cameras. I saw him returning to the pickup truck. However, instead of getting inside, he stood beside the vehicle looking toward the back area of the convenience store. A few seconds later, one of the figures emerged from the side corridor of the building. Then the second appeared. Both men walked back toward the truck as if they were returning from a specific destination. They did not look lost or confused. They looked like they had completed a task. The 3 exchanged a few words that I obviously could not hear through the cameras. Then they got into the vehicle. I kept watching, expecting them to leave, but the pickup truck remained parked. The next 10 minutes felt like an entire hour. The 3 men remained inside the vehicle once again, exactly as they had when they first arrived. I could not stop watching them. Several times I had the feeling they were observing the store the same way they had before. The only difference was that now I knew 2 of them had spent time walking around the back of the building for no apparent reason. Finally, shortly after 5:20 in the morning, I saw headlights appearing at the entrance to the parking lot. It was the manager's car. The moment he entered the property, something changed. The pickup truck turned on its headlights almost immediately. The 3 men did not wait even a minute. They pulled out of the parking space, slowly drove past the convenience store, and headed toward the highway. I watched until their taillights disappeared into the darkness. When the manager entered the store, I explained everything that had happened. We reviewed the footage together. The strangest discovery was that the 2 men had spent much of their time walking around the building, observing doors, windows, and access points. They never tried to force entry anywhere. They never committed any crime that we could identify, but they also never acted like normal customers. Later that same day, the manager mentioned the incident to a local police officer who regularly stopped at the station for gas. The officer asked to see the footage and asked a few questions. Several days later, he returned with information that I have never forgotten. According to him, A convenience store in another small town about an hour away had been robbed during the overnight hours just a few weeks earlier. Employees reported that before the crime, 3 men had spent nearly half an hour observing the location and asking questions about routines, employees, and busy hours. There was never any confirmation that they were the same people. The footage was too poor to identify anyone with certainty. Even so, hearing that made my stomach drop. To this day, I believe those men were evaluating the store and trying to determine whether it was an easy target. And what frightens me most when I think back on that night is the fact that they left at the exact moment they realized I was no longer alone. If the manager had arrived at his usual time, I might never have known what they were really planning to do. After the pickup truck drove away, I thought I would finally be able to relax. But the opposite happened. The more I thought about everything that had taken place, the stranger it seemed. The manager and I continued reviewing the footage for nearly an hour. At one point, we realized that one of the men had passed by the same spot behind the building several times. He was not simply wandering around aimlessly. He appeared to be observing something specific. Behind the convenience store, there was a metal door leading to the storage room and a small box containing controls for the exterior lighting system. Nothing that would be valuable to an ordinary customer. The man had remained standing there for almost 2 minutes. I never would have noticed that during the night because I had been focused on the man inside the store. That was when I started thinking that the questions about employees might have been only one part of what they were doing. It seemed far more likely that they were evaluating the entire structure of the location. How many people worked there? Which doors existed? Which areas were visible on camera? How much traffic passed through at that hour? Taken together, all of it painted a much more concerning picture than I had originally imagined. When I finally left for home that morning, I was completely exhausted. I remember driving down the highway while repeatedly checking my rearview mirror. It was an irrational reaction, but I could not help it. The image of that pickup truck remained stuck in my mind. I slept only a few hours that day and returned for my next shift still thinking about it. Over the following weeks, I never saw those men again. I never saw the pickup truck again. Even so, something changed in the way I viewed that job. Before that night, I believed the greatest risk was dealing with drunk customers or the occasional shoplifting incident. Afterward, I began to realize how much a person with bad intentions could learn simply by observing a store during the overnight hours. The most disturbing part was not a direct threat. It was not a weapon. It was not an attempted break-in. It was the feeling that those men were gathering information while pretending to be ordinary people. Even now, years later, I still remember how calm that man was while asking questions about employees, cameras, and schedules. And honestly, the more time passes, the more I believe that never finding out exactly what they intended to do is the most frightening part of the entire story. Story 3. My name is Ryan, and this happened when I was 31 years old. At the time, I was the manager of a small convenience store in a rural town in Missouri, near the Oklahoma border. The store operated 24 hours a day, but during the overnight shift, there were normally 2 employees responsible for partial closing procedures, cleaning, and restocking merchandise. On a summer Friday, one of the night shift employees called just a few hours before his shift to say he would not be able to come in. Since I was the manager, I had to cover the absence and handle practically everything by myself. It was not the first time that had happened. I knew every corner of that store and normally did not mind working alone. Business that night was relatively quiet. A few truck drivers stopped for fuel, some local residents came in to buy drinks and cigarettes, and after midnight the town practically went to sleep. Around 1 in the morning, the store became almost empty. The air conditioner produced a constant noise from the ceiling. The refrigerators hummed softly in the background, and silence eventually took over the building. I spent most of the night doing inventory, organizing products, and preparing reports that needed to be sent to the office the following morning. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Shortly after 3:30 in the morning, I began the final internal closing procedures. Even though the store remained open, there was a checklist that needed to be completed before the shift change. I had to inspect the aisles, check access doors, collect some restocking trays, and make sure no restricted areas had been left open. The store had 2 restrooms located at the back of the building near the hallway leading to the stockroom. Before finishing everything, I checked both to see whether they needed cleaning. The women's restroom was empty. When I tried opening the men's restroom door, however, it would not move. It was locked from the inside. That was not exactly unusual. Sometimes customers took longer than normal. I knocked on the door and announced that the area would be closed for cleaning in a few minutes. No response. I waited a few seconds and knocked again, this time harder. I still heard nothing. No toilet flushing, no footsteps, no sound of someone touching the lock. Just complete silence. I remember pressing my ear against the door and trying to listen. There was absolutely no noise coming from the other side. At first, I did not think anything strange was happening. My first assumption was that someone had accidentally engaged the lock, or that the mechanism had become stuck. That restroom was old and had experienced problems before. Even so, I continued trying to make contact. I knocked several more times and identified myself as the store manager. I said I only needed to know whether anyone was inside. Nothing. The silence began to bother me because the place was small. If someone were using the restroom, I would probably hear some kind of movement. On top of that, I had a fairly clear memory of the customers who had come through the store during the previous hour, and I could not remember anyone heading in that direction. I looked at the watch on my wrist. It was almost 4 in the morning. The hallway was illuminated by fluorescent lights that gave the area a cold and somewhat empty appearance. The stockroom was located right beside it, separated only by a metal door. From there came the familiar smell of cardboard, cleaning products, and stored beverages. The longer I stood in front of that locked door without receiving any response, the stranger it seemed. I decided to return to the counter and retrieve the emergency key that managers used whenever a customer became sick or got trapped because of a faulty lock. It took me less than a minute to return. When I arrived back at the hallway, I paused for a moment and stared at the door. It remained closed exactly as before. I inserted the key into the external lock and announced once again that I was about to open it. I waited a few seconds. No response. I slowly turned the key and pushed the door open. The restroom was completely empty. I remember feeling confused before I even felt afraid. I looked behind the door. I checked the stalls. I inspected the space beside the sink. Nobody was there. The small window near the ceiling was still closed and far too narrow for a person to fit through. The trash can was nearly empty, and the floor looked dry as though nobody had used the restroom recently. The strangest part was that the lock had truly been engaged from the inside. I could clearly see the mechanism in the locked position. I stood there staring at it for several seconds, trying to understand how it was possible. And that was exactly when I heard a sudden noise behind me. It came from the direction of the stockroom. It sounded like rapid footsteps running through one of the aisles between the shelves. The moment I heard those footsteps, my entire body froze. It was not a sound that could be mistaken for the air conditioner or the refrigerators. It clearly sounded like someone running. The noise came from inside the stockroom, moved quickly through one of the shelving aisles, and then disappeared. My heart started pounding so hard that I could feel the pulse in my neck. For a second, I tried convincing myself that maybe a box had fallen. Maybe something had slipped from a shelf. But I knew that sound. It was the sound of footsteps, and I was absolutely certain that nobody else should have been in that area. I immediately grabbed the flashlight attached to my belt and walked toward the metal stockroom door. When I opened it, I felt the warmer air coming from the storage area. The lights were still on. Rows of products stretched all the way to the back of the room. At first glance, everything appeared normal. No fallen boxes, no obvious signs of movement. Even so, I had a very strong feeling that someone had passed through there only seconds earlier. I slowly walked between the shelves, trying to listen for any sound. The stockroom was not enormous, but it contained several narrow aisles formed by stacks of boxes and metal storage racks. As I moved forward, the silence seemed to grow heavier. I could hear only my own breathing and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I swept the flashlight down each aisle, checking every corner. At one point, I even called out loudly and asked whether anyone was there. No response. I continued all the way to the back area where the delivery receiving door was located. When I pointed my flashlight in that direction, I felt an immediate chill in my stomach. The door was not completely closed. There was a small opening several inches wide. That should not have happened. I had personally checked that entrance at the beginning of my shift. On top of that, it was secured with a heavy safety bar that normally required some effort to move. I approached slowly and noticed that the bar had been displaced. Not completely removed, but clearly not positioned where it should have been. When I reached the door, the first thing I did was look outside through the opening. On the other side was the store's loading area, partially illuminated by a single yellowish light attached to the wall. Beyond that small circle of light was nothing but darkness. The area behind the building connected to a service alley used by delivery trucks during the day. At that hour of the night, there was absolutely nobody there. Even so, the feeling that someone had just left remained very strong. I opened the door fully and shined my flashlight across the concrete ground. Almost immediately, I noticed something that caught my attention. Near the entrance were fresh traces of dirt and dust scattered across the floor. They were not perfectly defined footprints, but they looked like signs left behind by someone who had passed through recently. The problem was that I could not tell whether the marks led from inside to outside or from outside to inside. I stood there staring at them for a few moments while trying to decide what to do. For the first time that night, I seriously considered the possibility that someone had been hiding inside the store for hours without my knowledge. I quickly returned to the main area of the convenience store and went straight to the room where the surveillance system was located. The store had several cameras covering the aisles, entrance, stockroom, and exterior areas. I sat down in front of the monitor and began reviewing footage from the previous few minutes. My goal was simple: find out who had run through the stockroom. However, the more footage I watched, the more uncomfortable I became. On one of the interior cameras, I saw something I definitely had not expected. About 10 minutes before I found the restroom locked, a figure briefly appeared in the hallway connecting the restrooms to the stockroom. I could not identify a face, age, or physical features because the person was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt. The figure appeared for only a few seconds before disappearing behind the storage shelves. The strangest part was that I had never seen that person enter the store. I rewound the footage several times to make sure I was not imagining things. The figure was there. And according to the system timestamp, that person was inside the building while I was helping customers at the front of the store, without any idea that someone else was moving around in the back. As soon as I saw that footage, I felt a mixture of relief and concern. Relief because I finally had an explanation for the footsteps I heard. Concern because it confirmed that someone really had been hiding inside the store. I continued reviewing the footage, trying to determine where the person had come from. I rewound much farther and began following every available camera feed. After some time, I found something that made me even more uneasy. Shortly before 2 in the morning, when the store still had some customer traffic, the same figure briefly appeared near the refrigerators at the back. The person stayed out of sight of most customers and seemed to carefully choose when to move. In several sections of the footage, they disappeared behind shelves or left camera frames for long periods of time. The more I watched, the more obvious it became that the person was intentionally avoiding being noticed. They did not look like someone shopping or using the restroom. They looked like someone trying to remain inside the store without drawing attention. The problem was that I could not find a single recording showing that person entering through the front door. It was as if they had simply appeared at some point during the night. While reviewing the footage, I heard the front door chime ring. It nearly made me jump out of my chair. I immediately looked at the front store monitor and saw a customer entering to buy fuel and coffee. I had to interrupt my review to assist him. During those few minutes, I became extremely aware of everything around me. Every time I looked toward the aisles, I imagined someone watching from somewhere inside the store. The customer paid and left without realizing how nervous I was. As soon as the door closed again, I temporarily blocked access to the restroom hallway and returned to the monitoring room. My plan was to call the police, but first, I wanted to determine whether the person was still inside the building. I continued reviewing the most recent footage. That was when I found a sequence that still bothers me whenever I think about that night. About 3 minutes before I opened the men's restroom, the hooded figure appeared walking toward the restroom area. The person entered exactly where the camera lost visibility. After that, they never appeared on any interior camera again. A few minutes later, I found the restroom door locked from the inside, and then heard someone running through the stockroom. At that point, I was no longer trying to find simple explanations. I picked up the store phone and called the local police. I explained that I believed someone was hiding inside the business during the night and described everything I had seen on the cameras. The dispatcher asked a few basic questions and informed me that a patrol unit would be sent to investigate. While waiting, I remained near the register, watching both the store and the monitors. The problem was that I now knew there were blind spots. There were places where someone could disappear for several minutes without appearing on camera. That made every aisle feel more uncomfortable. The air conditioner was still running normally, but I felt hot anyway. My hands were sweating, and I kept finding myself looking repeatedly toward the stockroom entrance. Several times I thought I heard small noises coming from that direction. A faint dragging sound, a light click, the distant sound of packaging being touched. Every time, I stopped to listen more carefully, and every time, the silence returned. It was impossible to know whether the sounds were real or whether my brain was turning ordinary store noises into something threatening. The patrol car arrived about 15 minutes later. 2 officers entered the convenience store, and I explained the entire situation again. I showed them the footage of the hooded figure, the locked restroom door, and the stockroom area where I had heard the footsteps. They took the situation seriously immediately. One officer stayed with me while the other began a complete search of the building. Shortly afterward, both officers started checking every aisle, every storage area, and every space behind stacks of merchandise. I followed them from a distance. When we reached the stockroom again, one officer shined his flashlight into a little used section where we stored old materials, disassembled shelving, and empty boxes. That was where we found something unexpected. Behind a stack of boxes was a narrow space where someone had clearly stayed for an extended period of time. There was a partially empty water bottle, open snack wrappers, and even a small dark backpack. That confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. The person had not entered the store only minutes earlier. They had probably been hiding there for hours. The officers examined the backpack on site before collecting it. I could not see many details because I stayed back, but I remember one of them mentioning extra clothing, food packaging, and ordinary personal items. Nothing that immediately helped identify who the person was. What really stood out was the fact that someone had apparently prepared that hiding place in advance. The area where we found the belongings was not visible from the stockroom entrance and was located behind materials that were rarely moved. If I had not heard the footsteps that night, that space might have remained undiscovered for much longer. While the officers continued searching the building, I began remembering small incidents from previous weeks that had not seemed important at the time. Some products found out of place. An interior door discovered unlocked one morning. A bottle of soda missing from inventory without explanation. Individually, none of those things stood out. But at that moment, I began wondering whether someone had been using the store as a hiding place for much longer than we realized. That possibility made me more uncomfortable than anything else that night. The search continued for several more minutes without anyone being found. Then one of the officers decided to check the exterior area behind the building again. I stayed near the loading door while they scanned the property with their flashlights. A short time later, one officer called to the other over the radio. Both quickly moved toward an area near a fence that separated the convenience store property from an abandoned lot. I could not hear exactly what they were saying, but their movements made it clear they had found something. When they returned, they explained that there were fresh marks crossing a patch of damp soil near the fence. They appeared to be footprints leading toward the vacant lot. They were not detailed enough to identify anyone, but they were recent. According to the officers, the person had probably escaped through the back only minutes before the patrol unit arrived. When I heard that, I immediately thought about the footsteps I had heard after opening the restroom. The more we analyzed the sequence of events, the more it seemed that the intruder realized they had been discovered and used those few minutes to escape through the loading exit before I called for help. In the weeks that followed, the situation continued bothering me more than I expected. The police were never able to officially identify the person who had been hiding inside the store that night. The camera footage was too poor to show a face, and the items found in the backpack did not lead to any immediate identification. What disturbed me most was wondering how long that person had actually been inside the building without anyone noticing. Our convenience store operated 24 hours a day. There were busy periods, deliveries, employees coming and going, and customers moving through the aisles. Yet someone managed to remain hidden in a stockroom area for hours, possibly even longer. After the incident, we began conducting much more thorough inspections. Every storage area was checked multiple times per shift. The regional manager even approved the installation of additional cameras in the stockroom's blind spots. Even with all those changes, I kept thinking about that locked restroom door. To this day, I still cannot fully explain how it was locked without me seeing anyone enter or leave. Whenever I remember that scene, I feel the same discomfort I felt when I opened the door and found the room completely empty. What stayed with me most, however, was not discovering the hiding place or learning about the escape route. It was realizing how close I had been to that person without knowing it. While I was helping customers, organizing merchandise, and doing my job as usual, someone was hidden inside the same building watching the store's routine. Maybe they were watching me too. I never learned what their intentions were. I never learned whether they only wanted a place to spend the night or whether they were waiting for an opportunity to do something worse. And honestly, I think that lack of answers is what makes the memory so unsettling. I have experienced difficult situations while working retail overnight, but none left me as uncomfortable as that one. Because that night there was no direct threat, no confrontation, and no explanation. There was only the certainty that someone had been hidden inside the store for hours, silently moving around the back rooms while I believed I was completely alone. And whenever I think about it, I still wonder how long it would have taken me to discover their presence if that restroom door had not remained locked. Story 4. I was 24 years old when this happened. At the time, I worked the overnight shift at a small convenience store located along a state highway in southern Arizona. The place was practically in the middle of nowhere. There were stretches of desert surrounding it, a few properties scattered several miles apart, and a small town about 20 minutes away by car. During the day, business was decent because of travelers, but overnight customer traffic dropped dramatically. On most nights, I spent more time organizing shelves and cleaning the store than helping customers. The convenience store operated 24 hours a day, and there was usually only one employee working the night shift. I was already used to the silence of the place. The constant hum of the refrigerators, the distant sound of trucks traveling down the highway, and the wind blowing through the parking lot were all part of the routine. That particular night was even slower than usual. I think I only helped 3 customers between midnight and 2 in the morning. After that, the store became completely empty. I remember looking out the window and not seeing a single car in either direction. Just darkness and the parking lot lights illuminating part of the property. One unusual thing about that convenience store was that there was still an old payphone standing next to the main entrance. It sat near an ice machine and had probably been there since the 1990s. The phone had never been removed because nobody wanted to spend money taking down the structure. The important detail is that the phone no longer worked. The line had been disconnected many months before what happened that night. The handset was still attached to the unit, but it had no service, could not make calls, and basically existed as a forgotten piece of equipment outside the store. I knew that because customers occasionally asked whether it worked, and I always told them it did not. Around 2:40 in the morning, while I was reviewing some paperwork behind the register, the automatic door suddenly opened. A man entered quickly, looking more rushed than any customer I had seen that night. He appeared to be around 40 years old, wearing jeans and a dark t-shirt, and he was sweating heavily despite the relatively pleasant temperature that morning. As soon as he walked in, he came straight to the counter and asked whether he could use the payphone outside because his cell phone had completely died. The question immediately caught my attention because almost nobody ever mentioned that phone. I replied that he could try, but explained that the phone had been disconnected for months and no longer had an active line. The man seemed surprised. He glanced through the window toward the payphone and then looked back at me. For a few seconds, I thought he was going to leave or ask to use my personal phone. Instead, he simply thanked me briefly and walked back out of the store. I thought it was odd, but I did not give it much thought at the time. I returned to the paperwork I was organizing and remained behind the register. About a minute later, I looked up out of habit and glanced toward the parking lot. That was when I noticed the man standing in front of the payphone. At first, that seemed normal. Maybe he was checking whether it really did not work. But after a few seconds, I started noticing something strange. He was holding the receiver to his ear, but he was not saying anything. His lips were not moving, he was not dialing numbers. He did not seem frustrated that he could not complete a call. In fact, he appeared completely focused on something else. More specifically, he seemed to be watching the store through the glass windows while keeping the receiver pressed to his ear. I continued observing discreetly for several minutes. The situation became increasingly uncomfortable because he barely moved. He simply stood beside the payphone, looking toward the convenience store. The parking lot was empty and silent. There were no cars at the pumps, no trucks approaching from the highway. Just that man standing alone beside the disconnected phone. I tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he had some personal issue and was distracted. But the longer I watched, the more wrong the scene felt. At one point, he slightly turned his head, and I had the impression that he was looking directly at me through the front windows. That genuinely made me uncomfortable. I decided to step outside briefly and make sure everything was okay. I grabbed the store keys, unlocked the side gate behind the counter, and walked toward the main entrance. When I pushed open the door and felt the cooler night air, my eyes immediately went to the payphone. The man was gone. He had disappeared within a matter of seconds, and I had not seen where he went. At first, I assumed he had simply walked out of my field of view. The parking lot was not huge, but there were a few dark areas near the sides of the building and behind the ice machine. I stepped farther outside and looked around. I did not see anyone. Not near the pumps, not by the parking spaces, and not walking toward the highway. That seemed strange because I had only taken a few seconds to leave the store. Even if he had decided to leave on foot, I should have been able to see him somewhere. That was when I approached the payphone. I picked up the receiver, which was still hanging beside the unit, and held it to my ear. As expected, there was no signal, not even the characteristic sound of an active phone line. Just silence. I pressed a few buttons out of curiosity. Nothing happened. The phone was completely dead. I stood there for a few moments trying to understand why someone would spend several minutes pretending to use a phone that did not work. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. And that was exactly when I noticed something on the other side of the parking lot. Near the edge of the area illuminated by the parking lot lights, there was a second person standing still. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or an object. I blinked a few times to adjust my vision. The figure remained there. It was someone standing in the darkness watching the store. I could not make out a face, clothing, or any physical details. The distance was too great, and the lighting was far too poor. The only thing I could clearly see was the outline of a motionless person facing my direction. An immediate chill ran down my spine. Instinctively, I looked around for the man from the payphone. Nothing. When I looked back toward the far end of the parking lot, the figure was still standing in the exact same spot. The feeling was difficult to explain. I had no proof that those two people were connected, but something about the situation felt wrong. The parking lot had been completely empty just a few minutes earlier. Now there was someone watching the store from the darkness, while the man pretending to use a disconnected payphone had vanished without a trace. For the first time that night, I seriously considered going back inside and locking the door. I returned inside immediately, though I did not run. I did not want to appear nervous if that person was really watching me. As soon as I entered, I locked the front door using the system that allowed temporary control of customer access during unusual situations. Then I went straight to the security cameras. The convenience store had several cameras covering the pumps, parking lot, and sides of the building. My goal was simple: find out where the man from the payphone had gone. I started by reviewing the previous few minutes. I could clearly see him leaving the store, walking to the payphone, and standing beside it. Up to that point, everything looked normal. The problem appeared when I advanced the footage a few seconds. At one moment, a pickup truck drove along the highway in the background, and its headlights created a strong glare across the camera lens. When the image returned to normal, the man was no longer standing by the phone. He was not shown walking away. He was not shown running. He was not shown exiting the frame. He simply was not there anymore. I replayed the sequence several times, trying to find an explanation. Maybe he moved during the glare. Maybe I was missing some detail. But regardless of the reason, I still did not know where he had gone. While reviewing the footage, I decided to check the cameras covering the parking lot. That was when I found something even stranger. The figure standing in the darkness was visible on one of the side cameras. The resolution was poor, but it confirmed that there really was someone there. The person remained motionless, facing the convenience store. I watched for nearly a minute. They barely moved. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On another camera positioned at a different angle, I could see a second figure appearing near the side wall of the building. It appeared to be the same man who had been standing at the payphone a few minutes earlier. He was walking slowly along the side of the convenience store, staying outside the main lighting area. He was not trying to enter. He was not leaving. He seemed to be circling the building while the other person remained standing on the opposite side of the parking lot. That was when I started believing it was not a coincidence. For the first time, I thought that the payphone had probably been nothing more than an excuse to approach the store and observe its routine. My first instinct was to call the police immediately, but before doing so, I continued watching the cameras for a few more moments. I wanted to understand what those people were doing. The longer I watched, the more deliberate the situation appeared. The man who had entered the store clearly knew exactly where the payphone was located. Even after I told him it did not work, he still spent several minutes standing there observing the inside of the convenience store. Now he was walking around the side of the building while another person remained standing in a dark section of the parking lot. None of it seemed random. I picked up the store phone and called the local police, explaining exactly what I was seeing. The dispatcher asked whether either of them had tried to enter or made any threats. I said no, but made it clear that both individuals were behaving in an extremely strange manner. While speaking, I continued watching the monitors. At one point, the man near the side of the building disappeared behind an area where the trash dumpsters and storage containers were located. The other figure remained standing in the same place. The feeling of being watched became so strong that I found myself constantly looking toward the front windows, just to make sure nobody was approaching the entrance. The next several minutes were the most stressful of the entire shift. The police informed me that a patrol car was on the way, but the town was small and the nearest officer was handling another call. I was alone in the store and knew it would take some time before anyone arrived. I continued monitoring the cameras without taking my eyes off the screens. Then I noticed something that made me even more uneasy. The man who had been circling the building briefly appeared near the back area, exactly where the service entrance and delivery storage room were located. He did not try to force anything open, but he seemed to be carefully examining the structure. A few seconds later, he disappeared from view again. Meanwhile, the figure standing on the far side of the parking lot had barely changed position since I first noticed them. It felt like some kind of surveillance. One person observing the store up close while the other maintained a distance. I tried convincing myself that there might be an innocent explanation, but none made sense. If they needed help, why did they not ask? If they were waiting for someone, why stay hidden in the darkness? And if they were simply passing through, why were they still there after so much time? The answer came just a few minutes before the police arrived. While watching the cameras, I saw something suddenly change. The figure standing at the edge of the parking lot finally began to move. They did not walk toward the store. They did not run. They simply took a few slow steps backward, moving even deeper into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. Almost at the same time, the man circling the side of the building briefly reappeared on one of the exterior cameras. The two seemed to be acting in coordination, even though they were never close to each other. Then I saw headlights appearing in the distance along the highway. It was the patrol car. The moment its lights became visible near the property entrance, both men disappeared almost immediately from the monitors. One moved into the darkness beyond the parking lot. The other vanished near the side of the building. The officers arrived less than a minute later and began searching around the convenience store. They checked the parking lot, inspected the rear area, looked around the dumpsters, and even searched part of the land near the highway. They found nobody. It was as if the two men had simply decided to abandon the area the instant they realized help was arriving. After I showed the recordings to the officers, one of them made a comment that I have never forgotten. He asked whether I was sure the man actually needed to use a phone. When I answered no, he said it looked more like someone trying to determine who was working alone and what the store's overnight routine looked like. There was never a formal investigation because no crime actually occurred. No doors were forced open, no merchandise was stolen, no threats were made. Even so, that night stayed with me for a long time. A few days later, I spoke with the owner of the convenience store and learned that other isolated businesses in the region had experienced similar situations involving people observing overnight activity before attempting thefts or break-ins at later dates. I never found out whether those men had a specific plan or were simply evaluating the location, but to this day, I remember the feeling I had when I picked up that dead payphone and realized the man never intended to make a call. The line had been disconnected for months. He knew that within seconds of putting the receiver to his ear. Yet he remained there watching the store. And honestly, when I think back on that night, I get the feeling that the phone was never the reason he entered the convenience store. It was simply the excuse he found to watch me without raising suspicion. Story 5. I was 26 years old when this happened. At the time, I worked as an overnight stock clerk at a large convenience store attached to a truck stop in central Tennessee. It was the kind of place that never really closed. Truck drivers came and went throughout the night, fueling up, grabbing coffee, buying food, and continuing their trips. The building was much larger than a typical convenience store. In addition to the main sales area, there were storage rooms, stock aisles, a large walk-in cooler used to store beverages, and several employee-only areas. My shift started at 10 at night and ended around 6 in the morning. Most of my time was spent restocking coolers, organizing beverage cases, and preparing merchandise for the following day. I usually worked alongside a few coworkers spread throughout different sections of the building, but for much of the night I ended up alone in certain areas. After several months on the job, I knew the routine well. I knew which sounds were normal, which equipment tended to malfunction, and which parts of the building were completely empty overnight. That was exactly why what happened that morning caught my attention so quickly. It was a little after 2 in the morning when I started restocking the beverage coolers near the back of the store. To do that, I had to constantly go in and out of the main walk-in cooler, a large refrigerated room where hundreds of cases of soda and water were stored. The door to that cooler was heavy and equipped with a powerful automatic closing mechanism. Normally, once someone closed it, it remained completely shut until another person opened it again. While carrying cases to the coolers, I noticed that the door was partially open. I did not think much of it the first time. I assumed I might not have closed it properly myself. I pushed it shut until I heard the latch engage and continued working. A few minutes later, when I returned to grab more merchandise, I found the door open again. That seemed unusual, but I still assumed it could be a problem with the seal. The equipment was old and occasionally had minor issues. I closed the door again and continued working without paying much attention to it. About 10 minutes later, the same thing happened again. I was organizing soda cases when I looked over my shoulder and saw the cooler door cracked open once more. This time, I stopped and watched. I was about 15 yards away from the door. There was nobody nearby. No other employees worked in that area during that part of the shift. There was also no airflow strong enough to move a door that size. Yet it remained open by several inches. I walked over and inspected the seal. Everything looked normal. The rubber gasket was intact, the latch worked, and the closing mechanism showed no obvious signs of damage. I shut the door again and stood there watching for a few seconds. Nothing happened. I returned to work and tried to ignore it. As the night went on, though, I found myself becoming more bothered by it than I should have been. Maybe because I knew that piece of equipment so well. Maybe because the door was far too heavy to repeatedly open on its own. Or maybe because that part of the building felt unusually quiet that night. I could hear only the steady hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of trucks pulling up to the fuel pumps outside. Shortly before 3 in the morning, I found the door open for the 4th time. That was when I decided to check the security cameras. There was a small office in the back where supervisors could access the surveillance system. My goal was simple: confirm whether another employee had been passing through without me noticing. I sat down in front of the monitor and rewound the footage from the camera pointed at the cooler entrance. At first, everything looked normal. I appeared on screen going in and out carrying beverage cases. After a few moments, I saw the exact point where the door had last been closed. I kept watching. A few seconds later, something happened that made my stomach immediately drop. The door began to move. It did not swing open quickly. It opened slowly, a few inches at a time. But before that happened, the recording clearly showed something appearing in the narrow gap between the door and the frame. It was a hand, not a shadow, not a reflection. A human hand emerging from inside the cooler and pulling the door until it closed completely. Then the hand disappeared. About a minute later, the door slowly opened by itself again. I stared at the screen for several seconds, trying to convince myself that I was misinterpreting what I had seen. I rewound the footage and watched again, then again. The result was always the same. The hand clearly appeared for a fraction of a second, gripping the inside edge of the door. I could not see an arm, a face, or any other part of a body. Just the hand pulling the door shut. What made it even stranger was the fact that I was certain nobody should have been inside that cooler. I had entered it several times during the previous half hour and had not seen anyone. The room itself was relatively simple. There were aisles formed by stacks of beverages, but not many places where a person could hide without being noticed. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. My first reaction was to assume that one of my coworkers was pulling some stupid prank. But that explanation quickly fell apart. None of the overnight employees acted like that, and I could not imagine someone sitting inside a freezing cooler for that long just to play a joke. Even so, I decided to go back and check for myself. When I returned to the cooler area, I felt a tension that had not been there before. The walk-in cooler looked exactly as I had left it. The door remained partially open. Cold air spilled into the aisle while the compressor emitted its steady background hum. I grabbed a flashlight we used to locate merchandise in darker areas and stepped inside. The temperature was always cold in there, but that morning it somehow felt colder than usual. I walked through the narrow aisles formed by stacks of cases, shining the flashlight into every corner. I called out for any employee who might be hiding inside. Nobody answered. I continued all the way to the back of the cooler. I found no one. No obvious sign of recent activity. However, just as I was preparing to leave, I noticed something on the floor that I did not remember seeing before. Near the entrance were damp marks on the cold concrete. They looked like footprints. They were not perfectly defined, but they were recent enough to still be visible. What struck me as strange was their direction. The marks did not lead out of the cooler. Instead, they led toward a secondary door located at the back, a passageway that connected to a storage area rarely used by employees during the overnight shift. I knew that storage area, but I almost never needed to go in there. It was mainly used to store old equipment, dismantled shelving, maintenance supplies, and merchandise that had not yet been distributed to the correct departments. Most employees could go weeks without opening that door. As I approached it, I noticed that it was not completely closed. There was a small gap between the door and the frame. That immediately caught my attention because it was normally either locked or fully shut. The damp footprints ended right there. My heart started beating faster as I stared at the opening. The aisle behind me was empty. The only sound was the constant hum of the refrigeration equipment. For several seconds, I just stood there trying to decide whether I was overreacting. Maybe an employee had been there earlier. Maybe the footprints were old. But the more I examined the situation, the less sense it made. The hand in the recording, the door repeatedly opening. Now the footprints leading into a rarely used part of the building. Everything felt connected in a way I could not explain. I slowly pushed the door open and shined my flashlight inside. The space was much larger than it appeared from the outside. There were narrow aisles between stacks of boxes, equipment covered with tarps, and metal shelving packed with stored materials. Some of the lights worked, but many had burned out, leaving sections of the room buried in shadow. The smell was different from the rest of the store. It was a mixture of dust, old cardboard, and dampness. I walked slowly, following the trail of footprints while listening for any sound. At one point, I thought I heard something moving deeper inside. It was not loud. It sounded like something brushing against boxes or being dragged a few inches across the floor. I stopped immediately. The silence returned. I continued forward much more cautiously. As I illuminated the aisles, I realized that the area contained countless places where someone could hide without being easily seen. Behind some stacks of merchandise were blind spots not visible from either the entrance or the cameras covering the main storage room. For the first time that night, I seriously considered the possibility that someone was using that section of the building as a hiding place. That was when I decided not to continue alone. As curious as I was, I also knew it was not my job to confront someone hiding in a storage area in the middle of the night. I returned to the main part of the store and found one of the overnight supervisors. After a few minutes, I located Mike, who was working near the front registers. I explained everything I had seen, from the cooler door to the recording of the hand appearing from inside. At first, he seemed skeptical. Honestly, I probably would have reacted the same way if someone had told me that story without evidence. I took him to the surveillance room and played the footage. His reaction changed immediately. We watched the clip several times. The hand was clearly visible. There was no doubt about it. Mike decided to call the truck stop's security manager and instructed everyone not to enter that storage area alone until we figured out what was happening. While we waited, I kept watching the cameras. Several times I thought I saw movement in the storage room's blind spots, but the video quality was too poor to be certain. The only thing I knew for sure was that I could no longer look at that cooler door without feeling a growing sense of unease. About 20 minutes later, the three of us returned to the storage area. This time we carried stronger flashlights and radios. The manager searched the aisles while Mike and I checked the spaces between stacks of boxes. The search moved slowly. In some places, we had to shift old materials just to see behind metal shelving units. It was during one of those inspections that we found something unexpected. Behind a row of old equipment was a makeshift space that clearly was not part of the normal organization of the storage room. Several boxes had been rearranged to create a small area hidden from the view of anyone walking through the main aisles. Inside that space was a backpack, 2 empty water bottles, food wrappers, and a thin blanket folded against the wall. For several seconds, nobody said a word. That was not random trash. It looked like a place where someone had been staying. Maybe for hours, maybe for several days on different occasions. The moment I saw it, I immediately thought of the hand in the recording. The feeling that someone had been hiding inside the building while employees and customers moved around normally became impossible to ignore. The police were called shortly afterward. While we waited for them to arrive, nobody worked in that section of the building. We stayed near the entrance to the storage room, watching the aisles and monitoring the cameras. When the officers arrived, we showed them the recording of the hand, the footprints, and the makeshift hiding area. They conducted a complete search of the building, including exterior areas, secondary storage rooms, and the grounds surrounding the truck stop. No one was found. The closest thing they discovered to a lead was a set of recent shoe prints near a service exit located at the back of the complex. According to the officers, it was possible that someone had left shortly before we began the more thorough search. Their theory was that the person had been using the storage room as a temporary shelter during the overnight hours, taking advantage of the building's size and the constant activity of the truck stop to avoid detection. I never found out whether that explanation was correct, but it made sense, especially after seeing the hidden space behind the boxes. What bothered me most was wondering how long it had been happening without anyone noticing. Over the following weeks, additional cameras were installed in that area, and access to the storage rooms became much more restricted. No one was ever found hiding there again, and the cooler door never opened by itself after that night. Even so, that morning remained burned into my memory in a way very few work experiences ever have. I have dealt with aggressive customers, emergencies, and security issues, but nothing made me as uncomfortable as watching that recording. Because until that moment, I believed I was alone in an area I knew perfectly. Then I discovered that someone could have been moving through those aisles without being seen. Whenever I remember that hand appearing from behind the cooler door, I think about how many times I walked into that room during the night with absolutely no idea that another person might be inside. And honestly, what scares me most is not what we found that morning. It is the possibility that the person had been hiding there for far longer than we ever managed to discover.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.